Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 2 of Carl's Christian Podcast. Happy Independence Day, July 4th. Today, I am here with Pastor Mark from New Harvest Christian Life Church in Surrey, Virginia. And today we'll be talking about what Independence Day is all about. Was our country built on Christian values? Who wrote the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution? And do we need God in our government? But before we start, I want to introduce Pastor Mark, let him tell a little bit about himself.
Well, thank you, Carlton. It's good to be here with you today on this podcast. What an honor to be a part of this whole thing. And I'm a pastor here at New Harvest, and like he said, in Surrey, Virginia, and looking forward to spending some time here with you and answering these questions and delve into what this day is really all about.
Yes, sir. So, the first question was, what is Independence Day all about?
Well, Independence Day, is something we celebrate every year. And the understanding of it is one that goes in many different directions. The main event is that basically in 1776, we declared independence from a tyrannical government that was suppressing the American people. And by the way, most of the people at that time were loyalists to the government of England. And they really didn't want a war with England. They wanted to be at peace just like anybody else would want to be at peace. But the government of England, the King of England specifically, got to the point where he was just disregarding everything, all their rights, anything that they wanted to. They didn't have any representation at all with the government. And it got intolerable. As a matter of fact, it got to the point where they decided, hey, we've got to do something. They petitioned their government, they petitioned the king, they did everything they knew to do peaceably. They did not want war because basically they believed that they had the biggest standing navy in the world at the time. They didn't really believe they could defeat them, but it had got to the point where they had to either submit to a tyrannical government for the rest of their lives. At that point, with their boot on their neck, basically, or stand up and say, we want something more than what you're giving us, and you're going to have to do better. And the king was unwilling. And as a matter of fact, if the king would have just catered to them in just some aspects, it's very possible that we would still be a part of England today. But because there was no giving on his part at all, America had to break away. It just got to the point where even the soldiers were just ignoring the people and being very disrespectful, and it got to the point where it got violent. And so these men got together and they formed this time of separation from England, and it led to war. And we all know the outcome of it, and basically that's what we're celebrating on July 4th, is this breakaway from something that was basically not godly. And I'll read some of the first words of the Declaration of Independence. When we finally did win the war, and they sat down and wrote this declaration, it was really written, some of it was written directly toward the king. And they wrote, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station in which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Okay, so I mean that's And the language that they used back then is not the same language you use today, but it is beautifully written, and it is very precise. Then they go on to say, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I mean, that's not too much to ask, is it? Not really.
No, sir.
No. So to secure these rights, governments and institutions among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that's important, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. And it goes on to list several grievances that they had. So a lot of people don't know that the Declaration of Independence actually states many grievances that the people had with the king in England. So today we're celebrating the Declaration of Independence, and that's what it is.
Okay, so who were some people who were involved in framing it?
Well, we know, the first name that comes to mind, of course, is Thomas Jefferson, who actually, penned it. But after that, it was looked over and studied, and they made some changes to it. Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, several others. They took a look at it, and it wasn't worded exactly how Thomas Jefferson originally penned it, but pretty close. It was pretty close. There was just some, without going into a lot of detail, there were some changes that they made, some wording that they wanted to change that they felt was more appropriate.
Yeah. So were all these people who wrote it Christians, or who framed it Christians?
All the ones that framed the Declaration of Independence, or the Constitution?
The Constitution.
The Constitution. Okay, so the people that framed the Constitution were people, not all of them, no, but the vast majority of them were. And even the ones that weren't were impacted by the culture, because the culture of that time was one of Christianity.
Yes, sir.
It's what enveloped the world view at that time in America, not necessarily in Europe, but that's what had taken root in America, because there had been a lot of revivals that had taken place at that time. And as a matter of fact, America was practically in a revival at that time. So, yes, the people that wrote the Constitution were either, a lot of them that wrote it were actually pastors or men of influence in their Christian beliefs. They were men who were influenced directly by the Bible itself. So the answer to your question is definitely yes, but not it's like anybody else in any other time. People don't 100% agree on everything, but they did agree that the Bible was the source of the writing and the actual the thought process that went into writing the Constitution was influenced directly from their beliefs that came out of the Word of God. Yes.
So our country was built on a Christian foundation and Christian values.
Without a doubt. There's volumes of proof of that. No matter what the secular humanists say, this country was founded on the thoughts and ideas of Judeo-Christian foundation of Christian values and Christian thought. I can read you something here from our book, America's Providential History. We see here, just to answer that question, we see here that the framers, and I'll read right from the book. It says the framers of the Constitution unabashedly declared that forming that document was a miracle of God. Okay, Franklin was the least orthodox of all, and yet he wrote, "Our General Convention, when it formed the new federal Constitution, was influenced, guided, and governed by the omnipotent and benefact ruler in whom all life and move and have their being." James Madison, the father of the Constitution, now there you go, James Madison was literally considered the father of the Constitution, was writing to Thomas Jefferson in France just a few weeks after the convention. He said, "It's impossible to conceive the degree of concord which ultimately prevailed as less than a miracle." Now he's talking about them being in the convention hall where they were trying to put together the Constitution. They were having problems. They were at a standstill. And he says it's impossible to conceive the degree of concord. That's not a word we would use today. We might say unity. Okay? We might say it's impossible to conceive the degree of unity, he said concord, which ultimately prevailed as less than a miracle. And later, Madison wrote, "It's impossible for the man of pious reflection not to perceive in it, the Constitutional Convention, a finger of that almighty hand." Perhaps the greatest affirmation of this came from the most influential of all the framers of the Constitution, George Washington himself. In a letter to his good friend, Governor Jonathan Thumble of Connecticut, he wrote that the adoption of the proposed general government disposed him to be of the opinion that miracles have not ceased. For he said, "One could trace the finger of Providence through those dark and mysterious events which first induced the states to appoint a general convention and then led them one after another into an adoption of the system recommended by the General Convention." On June 28, 1787, the Constitutional Convention was on the verge of complete rupture. For over a month, the delegates wrestled with the issue of representation with no breakthroughs, and now patience was wearing thin, emotions were on edge. A somber George Washington, presiding over this assembly, began to despair of seeing success in the convention. But the oldest delegate in attendance, Dr. Benjamin Franklin, asked for permission to speak. It was unusual. The 81-year-old Pennsylvanian, up to this point, wrote out his remarks and had someone else read them due to his infirmity. By this time, he was stirred to rise and address the delegates himself, and he says, "The small progress we have made over 4 or 5 weeks with each other is a melancholy proof of the imperfection of the human understanding. In this situation of this assembly, groping as it were in the dark to find political truth, and scarce able to distinguish it when presented to us, how has it happened, sir, that we have not hitherto once thought humbly, applying to the Father of lights to eliminate our understanding?" So Benjamin Franklin continues on and he says, "In the beginning of the contacts with Britain, we were sensible of danger. We had daily prayers in this room for divine protection." Now he's standing up and saying that, look, we're not getting anywhere. We're not getting anywhere. And we need to remember that we were in this same hall like 13 years ago, I think it was, when we wrote the Declaration of Independence. See, now it's years later, and they're writing the Constitution. You know, we prayed in this hall, and we got results from our prayers. And he says, Benjamin Franklin continues on, and he says, "Our prayers, sir, were heard, and they were graciously answered. All of us were engaged in the struggle must have observed frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favor. Have we now forgotten this powerful friend? Or do we imagine we no longer need his assistance? I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see to this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow can fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an entire empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings," now he's talking about the Bible, "that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it." That's Psalm 127, verse 1. Now this is the least religious of them, is quoting Scripture. "I firmly believe this. I also believe that without his concurring aid," talking about God, "we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel. We shall be divided by our little political and partial local interest. Our projects will be confounded, and we ourselves shall become a reproach and byword down to future ages. I therefore beg leave to move that henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessings on our deliberation be held in this assembly every morning, and that one or more of the clergy in this city be requested to officiate in that service." And then what happened is, now this is after 4 or 5 weeks, they were losing hope. They were totally in despair. They didn't think it was going to happen. They were about to give up. Well, this little speech that Benjamin Franklin spoke, of course, you can, from listening to it, you can see how stirring it was and how just perfect timing it was. It was just a perfect time. And that in itself was a God intervention, in my opinion, that he stood up and gave this inspired speech to implore God's direction. And that's exactly what they did. And I don't mean they got in there and just, prayed little lay me down to sleep prayers. They got in there and prayed on their faces, probably for several hours before they even began to deliberate once again. So it was just several weeks after that they came up with the Constitution. So just a few weeks later, after prayers, supplications to the Lord, giving it over to God. So the answer to your question is God involved in our government, or was God involved in the beginnings of our government, and who framed them? Yeah, he was definitely involved. They thought he was involved. They implored him to be involved, and they believed that their prayers were answered.
Benjamin Franklin, and he was the least godly out of all of them.
He was the least godly out of all of them, so history says. But that just goes to show you that we say now that he was the least godly, but that tells you that really is a clue to the overall climate of the time. Even the least religious, quote unquote, people of that time were influenced by the culture of Christianity that had a great influence of what was going on in the American colonies, the American 13 colonies at that time.
Yes, sir. So it is important to have God in our government.
Well, without a doubt. I mean, we see from these writings, we see that God, and they believed that God had a providential hand in it. Now, yes, it is important. Okay, so, yeah, is it important to have God in our government? Well, the idea of government is actually God's idea. It's not man's. God is a God of order. The Bible itself says that the government will, when Jesus comes back, and it actually says in Isaiah that the government will rest upon his shoulders. So government is important to God, and we see that all through the Bible. If you remember in the book of Genesis, we remember that the Tower of Babel, where they tried to build this tower, but God came down and said, "No, that is not what I told you to do. I told you to." This was after the flood, and this is Noah's descendants, and I told you to disperse in the earth, but they decided to build this tower and to concentrate this power in one place. Well, if you look at history, you see that there's always this gravitation toward this concentration of power. And even God said, look, that's not good. It's not a good idea. And if you look at the story of Babel, you see that God came down, he confused their language, He disperses them over the face of the earth, which was an effective way of pivoting or preventing them from this concentration of power that surely would have led to slavery and more depravity, because the whole thing was done in a spirit of pride. Of course, this whole thing is the forerunner to what we are witnessing in our own time as the one world government. One world government is something that is trying to get its tentacles, it's trying to get a grip, it's trying to get implanted in our society, because it goes all the way back to the time of Babel, when man wanted to concentrate power into one place. And God came down and said, no, the nations was God's idea. He wanted the world to be divided up into nations and the different languages. Well, why? Because in God's wisdom, he saw that this division of power would be beneficial to man, and it would keep a small group of people of getting control of the whole world. So the founding fathers could see that this was God's thoughts. These are God's plans. This is God's idea. That's why you see the construction of the American government, that there's this separation of powers. Well, they didn't come up with this idea. This was God's idea, to have a separation of powers, right?
Yes, sir.
So, of course, now this whole thing is, this Babel thing, the Tower of Babel, is a forerunner to what we witness in our time. So there seems to be this natural gravitation to the centralization of power, of which God does not want. The nations were God's idea. It was God who saw that because of man's sinful nature, that the separation of languages and distance would prevent one person from getting power, what we would call an oligarchy. Only Jesus is qualified to do that. And that really is the bottom line. God wants man to govern himself. He created man to govern himself, but only under the guidelines and the standards of godly leadership. That's the only way man can govern himself. Our system of government came about because our founding fathers understood the principles of the need of separation of powers. They understood that the heart of man and the safeguards had to be put in place, even for those who call themselves Christians. The temptation for power is just too great. So when the King of England heard that Washington was giving up power only after 2 terms, he said, if this is true, Washington is the greatest man in the world. Nobody had ever done that before. See, that's why America is so different. America is not governed by a monarchy. It's governed by a group of government officials who get their power from the people, and that had never been done before. So King George, who made that statement, didn't know what President George knew, that the Bible has the plan for government, and that he, President George, was just a part of that plan, and that the rights of men, that comes from God. That one selfless act by itself was enough to prove that he was a man of God. Nobody could, if you read even just a little bit of history from an honest perspective, I'll say that again, you would see that George Washington was a godly man, and all these men that were involved with the writing of our Constitution were godly men. Now this is important. So anybody that knows me knows that I love my country, but I don't love my country. I'm not loving my country because of who she is now. I love my country because it's of God's providential hand in our history, and because of God's great providential hand in our future. All right, so you want to talk, so this is July 4th, and we're talking about independence. We're talking about freedom. So a really good question would be, where does really freedom come from, and does God want us to have freedom? Are we to be free? And true freedom is found in the law of God, the precepts of God. So outside of those perimeters, there are traps and deception. The fact that there is freedom in the law of God is somewhat of a paradox. And when I say paradox, I mean the word paradox itself actually means a seemingly absurd, self-contradictory statement or proposition that when investigated or explained may prove to be well-founded or true. Interesting, huh?
Yes,
That's exactly when we talk about the freedoms that we find in the law of God. We think of laws as being constricting, but actually the law is what brings freedom. It's sin that brings loss of freedom. No nation has seen the prosperity and freedom that America has seen. It's also true that we're also just one generation from losing those freedoms because of ignorance and apathy toward the Word of God. That's why history is important. That's why celebrating the 4th of July, Independence Day, is so important. We need to talk about our history. We need to teach our history, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Just as long as it's the truth, that's all that matters. We don't want to, America has a lot of things in its history that are not so good. Well, that's the truth. But it's also the truth that we were founded on basically a miracle of God, and that freedom has taken place in this country. You can't say that this hasn't been the most freedom-loving country that's ever existed if you just study history even just a little bit. So each generation is to teach the next about the ways of God if we want to continue our freedom, because we're not just talking about a government. We're talking about a government that's operated under godly principles, because that's the only one that will really work and bring freedom. All other governments that are not steeped in or founded in or rooted in the concepts and precepts of God, if you notice, do not have and enjoy the freedoms that we have, which incidentally are eroding. Our freedoms are eroding, and just on the premise of we have moved away and moved from the center of our godly principles. So when you move away from godly principles, you automatically start losing freedoms. That is the first thing to go, is your freedom. So we're talking about each generation is to teach the next, and so that we can maintain freedom. And that's why, one of your questions is, should Christians, or should God be in government, or should Christians be in government? Well, if we want freedom, we better be in government. We better be involved in government instead of why let secular people run it?
What does secular mean for those who don't know what secular means?
Oh, well, secular means anything that's basically without God in it. Secular means we don't want God involved in the processes of government. So when I say secular government, those are people who wish not to have a godly mindset involved in the government.
As you said, with God in the government, it gives us more freedom. You can notice when he's taken out that it restricts what we are able to do.
We do. We see that in real time.
Yes,
we
sir.
see that in real time in what's going on in the world and in our country right now. So it's evident to anybody with eyes to see. If you really want to look at it honestly, you can. If you really get down to the root of it and you look at it honestly, you say, what's going on here in this country? Why is there so much turmoil? Why is there so much upheaval? Why are we losing our freedoms? Well, if you really get down to the core of it, and you trace back, that's why our history is so important. If you trace back to the root of how we started, And why we achieved such greatness is because of our foundational root in biblical values. So, Christian thinking is the thing standing in the way of one world government or socialism or communism, which is an ungodly form of government. So it means that, let's take socialism for instance. Socialism is literally man's attempt to govern himself without God. That's what socialism is. I mean, that's my definition of it. So I'm going to give you a quote from Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln said, "The philosophy of the schoolroom in one generation will be the philosophy of the government in the next." What a profound statement. That's why the ungodly Marxist socialists have targeted higher education for indoctrination. Still thinks Christians shouldn't be involved in politics? Well, that's exactly what they want you to think. Education is the key. And the Word of God says, "My people perish for a lack of knowledge." And of course, that's godly knowledge. So why should we aspire to a higher education? Should we aspire to this higher education to get a bigger house, a bigger car, more money to buy more stuff? No. It's to be used for teaching, to do justice, to deliver those with less opportunity into more opportunity, to lead in places of government where there is no leadership, to right what is wrong, and to be the head and not the tail for the purpose of glorifying God, who is the source of all knowledge. So, why should we get a higher education? Well, it's not really, we shouldn't want to get it to get rich, but we might want to get a higher education so that we can enrich others. And I bet they're not teaching that
In school.
in our secular schools right now. So, knowledge without God is not wisdom. And wisdom, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, without wisdom, I mean, how can you even form a government? How can you propagate a government? How can a government even function without wisdom? And God is wisdom himself. Unless you don't believe in God and you think that you have the wisdom to accomplish what needs to be accomplished in this, the vastness of government. I mean, really, we need wisdom, and God is the one that it gives it.
Yeah, I just thought of this. Everyone believes in God. When they say they don't believe that there is a God, they're just saying that they believe that there is a God, but they don't believe in him.
Right.
So they still admit that there is a God.
Right. Right. And so, but then they don't seek him out, or they don't bring him into the equation of what needs to be done, like in government. I mean, the most the wrongest thing we could do as a people is to exclude God from government. And that's the exact opposite of what the secular world mindset is to exclude God because we don't believe in God and we want to be separate from God. And the results of that is basically will definitely lead to less loss of freedom, and it'll lead to centralized power. It will always lead to centralized power, because centralized power is the natural gravitation of the human nature. Human nature just wants to gravitate and get a hold of power and to hold on to it. That's why when George Washington relinquished his power back to the legislature, that's why the King George said, well, he must be the greatest man that ever lived, because that was unheard of, and in their mind, that was crazy. But not to George Washington. He understood what was taking place and that God was involved. All right, yeah, so we're talking about the Constitution here. And so let me just give you the preamble to the Constitution. It's pretty, the preamble's pretty short. And The Constitution itself has a lot of articles in it, and it's pretty involved. But this preamble was just beautifully written, and it gives the idea and concepts of what they were trying to produce. And it says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish the Constitution of the United States of America, adopted September 17th, 1787, went into effect March 4th, 1789. Now, if you think about it, 1789, that was almost into the 1800s. You know, you think about it, it wasn't that long ago.
Well, we hope that we've given you all a picture of what it was like when our founding fathers wrote the Declaration of Independence, when they wrote the Constitution, how they felt that it was important that they added God and Christian values to it as they wrote it. And even Benjamin Franklin, the most quote-unquote least godly out of all of them, he believed that as well. And yeah, thank you, Pastor Mark, for coming on the podcast today.
Thank
really
you.
Appreciate it. And hope you all have a blessed day. We will see you in episode 3 of the next podcast. We hope you have enjoyed episode 2 of Carl's Christian Podcast. If you did, then please consider subscribing, leaving a comment on today's video, letting us know what you thought of the video, liking the video, and sharing it with a friend or family member. Anyways, hope you all have a blessed week. Remember what we talked about today, how God needs to be included in the government, and when he is excluded from the government, it restricts what we are able to do, and that having God in the government brings freedom. Anyways, hope you all have a blessed week. See you all in the next episode on Carl's Christian Podcast.